We are delighted to be joined by Bennedict Rogers, who, in this podcast, will be discussing religious freedom in China. Rogers is a British human rights activist, who is the co-founder and chairman of the Conservative Party's Human Rights Commission. We spoke to him as the East Asia team leader of the human rights organisation CSW.
Thank you very much, Bennedict, for joining us today. I wanted to start by talking to you about the organisation that you work in, CSW. So what is CSW and what do you do on a day-to-day basis?
So CSW is a human rights organisation specialising in freedom of religion or belief for everyone. We base our work on Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which guarantees that right for people of all faiths and indeed people of no faith, the fundamental right to choose and practice and change your beliefs. And in practice that means travelling to places where people are being persecuted or being denied their freedom of religion or belief, documenting what's happening, working alongside them to strengthen their capacity to speak for themselves, and speaking out for them in arenas like the British Parliament, the European Parliament, the United Nations, the US Congress, and other arenas as well.
Gosh, so recently there's been a lot in the media about China and their lack of freedom of religion. So what is the general picture surrounding freedom of religion currently in China?
Well, China is currently going through what many would say is the worst crackdown on religion since the Cultural Revolution, and it's affecting everybody. The crackdown on Christians is particularly severe. We've seen churches, thousands of churches destroyed or crosses torn down, churches closed, pastors and priests imprisoned. There's talk of producing a new translation of the Bible that is in keeping with the Chinese Communist Party's views. People under the age of 18 are prohibited from going to places of worship. There are facial recognition cameras at the altars in churches. But then, of course, we're seeing a horrific campaign of persecution against the Uyghur Muslims in the Xinjiang province in the west of the country, which is described as the largest incarceration of an ethnic and religious minority since the Holocaust. And then the situation in Tibet, the persecution of Falun Gong, which is a Buddhist-inspired spiritual movement, and the crackdown on other religious minorities as well continues. And
just specifically looking at the Muslims, why specifically what do the Chinese government want to target them? Recently there's been a range of award-winning documentaries looking at the persecution of the Uyghur Muslims in the concentration camps. So why specifically are the Chinese government focusing on them?
Well, it's said that at least 1 million, maybe as many as 3 million Uyghur Muslims are in these horrific prison camps in dire conditions. The Chinese government uses the excuse of countering terrorism, and it is true that there have been over the years some incidents of terrorism by a very tiny minority of Uyghurs, and that's a sign of their desperation in response to decades of persecution. But the idea that 1 million or 3 million Uyghurs are terrorists or even extremists is an absurd idea. That's the justification they use. But essentially, it's the Chinese Communist Party's both desire to control and indeed ultimately eradicate religion. And incidentally, there is talk of them producing a translation of the Quran that is in keeping with Communist Party values in the same way that they're talking of doing the same with the Bible. And it's an ethnically driven campaign. It's a expression of racial prejudice against the Uyghurs.
And recently there's been, what's come to light, have been the China cables, which obviously came to light in 2019, and this has caused widespread outrage among international leaders. So what exactly are the China cables and what sort of elements do they contain?
So the China cables were the leaking of hundreds, I think initially 400 and then further pages since then, 400 pages of classified, secret Chinese government documents that really reveal the Chinese regime's deliberate campaign with, if it isn't a genocide, it certainly has genocidal signs to it. The intention to eradicate the Uyghurs, and these documents were somehow leaked from presumably a very high-level source who wanted to expose this. The New York Times initially published them, and then other media as well, and it really reveals the Chinese regime's intent. The initial headline when they were first leaked was headlined, quote, "Absolutely no mercy," and that was a quote that came from one of these official documents.
And they've also been compared by the world's head of the Uyghur Foundation to something looking like out of a Nazi playbook. Do you think that this is a fair comparison, or do you think it has any relevance, not relevance, but any links to what's been going on with the growing Nazi threat, how that has also drawn parallels with the growing threat against Muslims?
Well, I think certainly in terms of both the scale of what's happening and the nature of the conditions in these prison camps, where torture is widespread, terrible reports of sexual violence, forced labour, and the incarceration of so many people, as well as, even outside the camps, the surveillance state that has been put in place in Xinjiang, Han Chinese Communist Party officials moving into the homes of Uyghurs, living with them to monitor their every activity, surveillance cameras on every block. All these are certainly reminiscent of Nazi behaviour, or indeed of Stalin's camps as well. And I think it is certainly one of the most serious mass atrocities of the 21st century.
So it's clearly a very serious issue. And is there anything that we as young people and we as a society can try to do in order to combat the threat, or in order to try and prevent what's going on currently?
Yes, I think it's incredibly important that we as a society and young people in particular speak up against what's happening, make people aware of it, expose it. I think there's been a tendency to some extent, in the international community, to kowtow to China and to treat China in a different way from the way we might treat any other regime. And I think that needs to change. So I would encourage young people to join in protests, to write to your member of parliament, to do whatever you can to encourage people in positions of authority to take a much stronger line.
People might say that because China plays such a strong role in trade and in the international communities, and the amount of products we have that are made in China is substantial. So by imposing threats on China that could possibly have a negative effect on the UK economy, how would you respond to that?
I'd respond in two ways. First of all, I'm not convinced that the evidence is there that when you speak out on human rights in China, that necessarily affects trade. It's a proven fact that Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel has been probably among world leaders the most outspoken on human rights in China generally, and has done so consistently over the years she's been in office. And Germany remains China's biggest trading partner. So I think China is, when it comes to trade, is pragmatic. They still want to sell goods to us, or if we have goods and services they want to buy, they will still do so. But the second point is that, do we want to trade at the expense of our values? Do we want to sell out our values and stay silent on mass atrocities like these just for the sake of trade? And I think my answer is we don't. We should have the courage of our convictions and stand by our values in the face of such severe repression. Because if we don't, I think the signs are already that China will become a greater threat to us as well as to its own people.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you very much for your time in speaking to us today. We really appreciate it. It's been an incredibly engaging and interesting interview, and I'm sure everyone watching will agree. So please make sure to click the notifications bell and subscribe if you want to see part 2 with Ben on other areas concerning Asia and human rights abuses going on there. Thank you very much, and goodbye.